Welcome back to We Want Picks. I'm Artem MMA, and I'm going to be breaking down the PFL Super Fights card, which is going to be headlined by the return of Francis Ngannou to MMA against Renan Ferreira. Also, a bunch of really good fights on this card as well. We have the Bellator Middleweight Championship on the line as Eblen rematches Fabien Edwards. Cris, Cyborg, and Larissa Pacheco fight against each other. They've been wanting this fight for a long time. There's a couple other really good prospects on there, like Husein Kadimagomaev, as well as Ibragimov, as well as a couple of really nice matchups between McKee, Paul Hughes, and Raufeon Stots fighting against Breno. This is a very good card that I don't see that many people talking about, and honestly, I don't understand why, because at the moment there is the UFC Apex card. It's not like they're competing against the UFC pay-per-view. Maybe people don't know about this card, or maybe people aren't as excited for Ngannou's return as I guess maybe I thought, but this is definitely a card to be looking forward to, definitely a card to be talking about. It is a pay-per-view event on, I believe, ESPN pay-per-view. Maybe it's on DAZN pay-per-view, but I do know that it is going to be on ESPN Plus for the prelims, taking place on Saturday, I believe at the same time as the UFC as well, maybe a little bit earlier with a 1:30 p.m. start as it is in Saudi Arabia. So, of course, with all that being said, I do have an article out as well on the We Want Picks website. I did all of the Contender Series videos for We Want Picks. Hopefully you enjoyed those, and now I'm going to break down the PFL card and other Bellator cards and other events that will be taking place aside from the UFC on the We Want Picks channel. So with all of that being said, I'll now see you guys in the predictions. So as usual with these PFL predictions, I will do the early prelims relatively quickly, and the first one is going to be between Tariq Ismail fighting against Taha Bendaoud. Taha Bendaoud has been struggling to find matchups for a long time now. He's a 3-0 prospect, he's a striker that does like to fight from range, and he's really been struggling to find fights recently for the PFL on the PFL Mania cards. But he's going to be taking on a little bit of an opposite matchup here. He is a striker, but now he's taking on Tariq Ismail, who is a wrestler. And I do believe that Tariq Ismail is going to be able to get the takedowns here against Bendaoud, and I am going to be picking Tariq Ismail to win this fight by decision. Ismail is a slight favorite, -165. Bendaoud is +135. Now we've got a classic PFL prelim fight between Ibragimov and Nacho Campos, a -1000 favorite here. You can't really do much with it, but I do think that Ibragimov does win. I wasn't able to find much on Nacho Campos. I did look into him, but I only really found his most recent fight. And in that one, he just spent the whole time defending a takedown, and then they split, and he knocked him out. So that's kind of it for Nacho Campos. I know that he is probably a bit more of a striker, seems to be a pretty powerful guy, but I don't necessarily think he's going to be able to stop the 7-0 Ibragimov, who just smoked Josh Reed in his PFL debut, and before that it's been looking really, really good. Only 20 years old, the PFL has signed this guy for a reason. Definitely an MMA prospect to watch out for, and I am picking Ibragimov to win this matchup. I think he does get the takedowns and can kind of do what he wants to from there. Now we have Makkasharip Zaynukov fighting against Dedrek Sanders. Makkasharip Zaynukov is actually surprisingly a lot more of a striker than I expected. You can find tape on him as well under the name Magomed Zaynukov, but he did fight for Gorilla FC, which ended up turning into Eagle FC, I believe, after Khabib acquired Gorilla FC. But he spent quite a few fights fighting them, and that's kind of the easiest way to find his fights is on the YouTube channel, even though he has fought for UAE Warriors a couple of times as well. Watching his fight against Alex de Silva, I was quite surprised that in that fight it was Alex de Silva trying to take him down for the most part, but he did eventually reverse positions, and he did end up taking down Alex de Silva quite a bit in that fight. But he does spend a lot of time striking. Against Mehdi Takayev, he did strike against Takayev, didn't really attempt too many takedowns and got knocked out. Unfortunate. But Alex de Silva is a former UFC fighter who has actually kind of gone on to have a pretty decent post-UFC run. The one loss was to Makkasharip, and then since then he's gone a little bit undefeated, which is quite good. But I do think that in this matchup, he can get the takedowns against Dedrek Sanders if he does look for them. I, of course, did, I guess, somewhat famously at this point, pick Sergio Cossio to defeat Dedrek Sanders, and Sergio Cossio went in there against Sanders and walked forwards with his hands below his waist for the whole fight, and he got knocked out, obviously. Dedrek Sanders is a striker. He does fight from range quite well, despite not really being the tallest guy for the weight class. But I do think against Zaynukov, he can get taken down here against the bigger guy. And Makkasharip on the feet, even though he's not a great striker, he's not bad. And I do think that he can stay safe against Sanders until he gets the wrestling going. And I do think he gets the wrestling going. And I think he's going to win by decision in this fight. Now we can move up to, I guess, like the really good fights. Raufeon Stots, the former champion of Bellator at 135 pounds, takes on Breno. And I am going to use a little bit of MMA math here, which I know a lot of people don't like. I personally don't like it, but I think it can apply. Raufeon Stots was able to out-wrestle Danny Savatello multiple times. He's beaten him twice now with the wrestling and most of the moments in that matchup. And Breno, we saw get finished by Danny Savatello, who doesn't finish anybody. And Danny Savatello goes out there and he just wrestles and he controls, but he doesn't really have a big finishing ability. And he was able to go out there, out-wrestle Breno and submit him. And even then, Breno has only actually fought for Bellator twice. He did beat Josh Hill in his debut, which is a pretty good win, but Hill's getting a little bit older. Before that, he was fighting for the LFA. And now he's taking on the former champion and Raufeon Stots, a guy who did lose, of course, to Pacheco in one shot KO. But before that was a pretty dominant champion for them. You know, he did beat Danny Savatello. He did win the decision, I thought. Knocked out Juan Archuleta for the belt. He has the win over Magomedov as well. Win over Josh Hill his own right. So he's kind of spent a lot of time against much better competition, out wrestling much better competition. And I do think that the takedowns are going to come against Breno here. He's a massive favorite, minus 455 on Tapology, but he actually is in the odds, I believe, a little bit wider than that. If I'm just trying to find him, minus 750 on FightOdds.io on Bet Online. So I guess the line has just been smoked. Makes sense. I know that Raufeon Stots is getting a little bit older now at 36 years old, but I just would be very surprised if he can't go out there and get the takedowns against Breno. And I don't really think he can finish Breno because he isn't really a finisher, but Savatello was able to submit him, so who knows. But the pick is Raufeon Stots by decision. And now we have AJ McKee versus Paul Hughes. Massive fight. Honestly, huge fight, and a fight I'm really, really looking forward to. AJ McKee, of course, is the former Bellator champion of featherweight, and Paul Hughes is a very hot prospect. He was actually, when he was in the free agency period after fighting for Cage Warriors and being a champion for them, I believe he was offered fights from the UFC and from the PFL, and he chose the PFL contract because he can fight multiple times for the PFL this year and then be in the tournament next year. So with that being said, when he said that he was going to fight like 3 times this year for Bellator and the PFL, I thought that he was going to be accepting easy fights, you know, fights that he's expected to win. He was expected to defeat Bobby King, and he did defeat Bobby King. He knocked him out. Very good performance as well against a veteran of Bellator. And I thought that he was just going to fight like quite a few guys that he can win, and then he can go out there in the tournament and then take the step up in competition. He's taking the step up in competition right now against AJ McKee, who, as I said, is a featherweight former champion for Bellator. He defeated Patricio Pitbull by that first round guillotine after hurting him, and then he did lose the rematch against Pitbull. After losing the rematch, he went up a weight class, had an interesting matchup against Spike Carlyle. It was kind of just like insane, like all Spike Carlyle fights are, to be fair. And then against Roberto de Souza, who is a former, well, current actually, and multiple time defending champion for Ryzen, he was able to look pretty good and stayed safe in the grappling. And de Souza is a very, very dangerous grappler. And in that matchup, a lot of the time, AJ McKee spent time in top control, staying safe and beating him in the grappling. He submitted Clay Collard recently in his first PFL fight, looked very good there. And in this fight against Paul Hughes, I think that he probably should grapple, because I think that Paul Hughes, he's well-rounded. Paul Hughes can grapple. We've seen him win fights with his wrestling and his grappling before, notably when he just dominated Jordan Vasenik, who's now in the UFC in their rematch. I think that Paul Hughes is going to probably want this fight on the feet, whereas I think that AJ McKee is probably going to want the fight on the ground. But I think on the ground is where AJ McKee is going to be at his best. We saw him able to go out there and out-grapple, control, and beat Spike Carlyle with the grappling 2 years ago in a much lower level of competition, I know, but still. And I think that we can see him go out there against Paul Hughes, who's going to be a dangerous striker, who's going to be looking to really prove himself as one of the best lightweights in the world, really, because when he chose not to sign with the UFC, it was met with some controversy, even though I'm sure he's getting paid more money by the PFL than what the UFC offered him. I don't think that he can out-grapple AJ McKee here. I think that AJ McKee is going to look to wrestle. I think he is going to look to grapple. And I do like AJ McKee in this matchup. So I am going to pick AJ McKee to win this fight by decision, but by using his grappling to get it done, because I think that Paul Hughes is still going to present a pretty big danger on the feet in this fight. And now we can move up the card to Husein Kadimagomaev making his PFL debut against Zafar, who is also making his PFL debut on this main card of the pay-per-view. And something tells me that the PFL are trying to build up Husein Kadimagomaev as a prospect and as a big name, giving him this pay-per-view main card slot over someone like Raufeon Stots as he fights against Breno. Husein Kadimagomaev is a wrestler for sure, and the way that this guy fights is he just spams takedowns, man, over and over and over again, especially in his fight for Brave. I believe it was this one here against Akshan Babayev. It's on YouTube. He spends like less than 20 seconds, I feel like, when the fight's on the feet before he shoots takedowns. He's just constantly going for takedowns against Babayev. And when he does eventually get top control, he does have very top control, very strong control, as well as pretty good ground and pound, but he does have a submission ability. He fights Zafar, who has fought for a bunch of promotions around Europe, but I guess most notably also fought for Brave, and this fight's also on YouTube. And Max Koga beat him by out-wrestling him. Zafar, I don't think is going to be able to defend the takedowns against Kadimagomaev, and even then, he actually is a very small guy for the weight class. He did look quite short and small against Max Koga, and I think taking on a guy that's 3 inches taller than him and pretty big for the weight class, he's going to be outsized here, and that's going to play a factor because of the fact that this fight is probably going to take place in the wrestling. So I do like Husein Kadimagomaev. He's actually minus 1,000, I believe. Minus 950 on Bet Online right now. The odds are just kind of nuts for a lot of these PFL fights, but I do think that Kadimagomaev does win. Maybe there's something to do with like a Kadimagomaev inside the distance prop, but who knows, man. I do think that Kadimagomaev is going to get the takedowns though, and it seems like the PFL are wanting to build him up. Now we have Johnny Eblen fighting against Fabien Edwards. Now this is actually an interesting one because it's on a PFL card, but the title on the line is actually the Bellator Middleweight Championship, which Johnny Eblen does hold since he defeated Gegard Mousasi a couple of years ago. He has defended that belt twice. He fought for the PFL against Impa Kasanganay in like a one-off 185-pound belt against Impa Kasanganay, who was the 205-pound champion for the PFL, if any of that makes any sense. Eblen is 15-0. He's a wrestler. You probably have heard of him if you are still not that familiar with the PFL, because he probably is the biggest name on the PFL Bellator roster. He's a pretty cool internet presence because he did all those skits about a year ago with that lady. If you know what I mean, you know what I mean. He had that girlfriend that he was spending so much money on and all this. It was kind of viral on Instagram Reels. Nonetheless, he's a good fighter. He beat Gegard Mousasi by out-wrestling him. I thought that Gegard Mousasi was going to beat him. I was wrong. And then since then, he beat Tokov by out-wrestling him and also beat Fabien Edwards, but he knocked him down on the feet and then used his ground and pound to finish the fight against Fabien Edwards. This is a rematch. There is bad blood here. These guys don't like each other. Fabien Edwards is the brother of Leon Edwards, and he actually does fight in a similar sort of style with the technical kickboxing background. He is a better striker, in my opinion, still, even though Eblen's boxing has been improving than Eblen. But it just comes down to, can he defend the takedowns? And I just don't think he can. I would be surprised if Edwards can just keep the fight on the feet against Eblen for at least 3 rounds out of 5, and even then land the more damaging blows and not be pressured backwards. So I do like Eblen here. I think there is a chance that you'll see him in the UFC at some point. The PFL doesn't have a middleweight division. It doesn't seem like they have that much intention of adding a middleweight division. So I do think that Eblen, whenever his contract runs out, Bellator's not going to be around forever. The PFL doesn't have 185 pounds. You might see Eblen go elsewhere. So be interesting to see what happens there. But anyway, in this fight, though, I think Eblen wins. I don't think he gets the knockout, though. I do think that Eblen is going to win this fight by decision. Now we can move up to a fight which I think a lot of people are going to be picking the underdog, whereas I'm not. I am still picking the favorite here. I'm picking Larissa Pacheco to defeat Cris Cyborg And I do think that the way that she's going to be able to get it done here is actually with the grappling. Now, Larissa Pacheco, a lot of people know Larissa Pacheco for having a lot of power on the feet, and that is true. She did spend the last season of the PFL, well, not the last season, the 2023 season of the PFL, just knocking all of these girls out. She knocked out Kolesnik in 14 seconds. She knocked out Leibrock in 45 seconds. And then the season before that, in 2022, she knocked out Kolesnik again, poor Kolesnik, in 2 minutes. Gina Fabien in less than 3 minutes. And Zamzakul in about 90 seconds. She was beating everybody in the promotion, aside from Kayla Harrison, where she lost a couple of times to Kayla Harrison, and then actually got a win over Kayla Harrison in 2022 in a fight which she looked much, much improved in the grappling. Now, Kayla Harrison was still taking her down, but Pacheco was showing pretty good jiu-jitsu, was able to reverse a lot of positions, get on top position when the fight was on the feet. Of course, it did favor Pacheco, and she showed pretty good cardio in that fight as well, and eventually, of course, did manage to slightly beat Kayla Harrison in that matchup. And then I will admit, after that fight against Harrison, she did look like she did take a little bit of a step down, because she didn't look that great against Julia Budd. But then we just saw her dominate the PFL season last year. Now, in this fight, she takes on Cris Cyborg. A lot of people, of course, know Cris Cyborg. She's the Bellator champion. She was a UFC champion as well at 145 pounds. And and then after that, she went for Bellator at 145 pounds and defeated a lot of those girls there. She has defended that belt many, many times. But I do think that in this fight, what we've seen from Cris Cyborg recently is that she's taken a little bit of a step away from MMA. She started to step into boxing, and she's been boxing, now she takes on a girl who, although a lot of people might think that she's going to go out there and just stand and bang with Cyborg, I don't think so. I think that Pacheco is going to look to get the takedowns here. Now, offensive takedowns isn't really that much of Pacheco's game. She also is a striker, but I do think that the option is there. And I like that the fact that she has more options to win. Whereas Cris Cyborg, I feel like the only real way for Cris Cyborg to win this fight is to just beat Pacheco up on the feet, which definitely could happen. Pacheco, although she is very aggressive, isn't really the most technical striker. We haven't really seen anyone outstrike Pacheco, though it is worth noting. I think that Pacheco can wrestle, I think she can grapple, and I do think she can wrestle and grapple better than Cris Cyborg can. And another thing as well about Cyborg, she's 39. She's not getting any younger. So I do like Pacheco in this matchup to win by decision. I believe the favorite on the odds, minus 150. It's getting wider. Minus 135 bet online. The majority of the public seem to be picking Cyborg, though. Now we can move up to the main event. The return of Francis Ngannou. And it's not an easy fight by any means. He does fight now against Renan Ferreira, who won the championship for the PFL in 2023. He defeated Denis Goltsov to do that in the tournament, and was actually able to defeat Ryan Bader in 21 seconds. And what was, I guess, probably like a title eliminator to fight Francis Ngannou, and he did it very, very impressively. Now, going through Renan Ferreira's career, he's got a lot of wins by KO and quickly. However, he does have a couple of interesting results. He did lose to Rizvan Kuniev, who was on the Contender Series this year and is now in the UFC. But Rizvan Kuniev was he's just been a bit of a naughty boy, a very, very naughty boy in that matchup. But nonetheless, another thing that a lot of people might know Renan Ferreira for is his win, which was overturned to a no contest against Fabricio Verdum, where it seemed like Ferreira actually tapped to a choke that Verdum had in, and then Ferreira was able to escape the choke due to the tap, and then TKO'd him. Is what it is, though. Renan Ferreira, he is well-rounded. He does have pretty good grappling, pretty good pure grappling for the weight class as well. We've seen him do that against Kausei Manutafa, who is just a tough guy. Not really the best guy, but a tough guy. And on the feet, he is going to present some sort of danger to most MMA heavyweights because he's 6'8", 85-inch reach. He's going to be a taller, longer heavyweight in this matchup, even against Ngannou, who's always been pretty known for pretty good reach. But against Francis Ngannou, do I think he can knock him out? No. And do I think he can take him down? I'm going to say no to that as well. Now, to be fair, with Francis Ngannou, he hasn't fought in MMA since 2022, and I believe this was January 2022, the last time we saw him fight, and I thought Cyril Gane won, but it is what it is. He got the win over Cyril Gane. And in that fight, Gane was outstriking him for a lot of it, but he was able to win using his wrestling. But after that, he then went on to box. And has he been practicing any wrestling at all since the boxing? Probably not, but does it matter? And does it even hurt him? It might even not hurt him. It might actually help him because he spent a couple of years now just training in boxing to deal with some of the best boxers on the planet, Anthony Joshua and Tyson Fury. And now he goes in there against MMA guys who definitely don't have as good boxing as Tyson Fury and Anthony Joshua, and he's just been training at that level of boxing. I think that we're going to see an improved version of Francis Ngannou even at the age of 38 years old. I do think he can now, I guess, just using boxing experience. I mean, it's crazy to think about this with like a championship level fighter, but he can use that to like navigate the cage better, close the distance a bit better, and land his big shots. I think he's going to land on Renan Ferreira. I think he's going to knock out Renan Ferreira. Now, the question that I have for Ngannou, though, is how often is he going to fight? Like, are we going to see Ngannou fight twice a year? Are we going to see him fight once a year? Is he going to fight in the tournament? Is he going to fight 3 times a year? I know he's got something in his contract where his opponent has to make $2 million, so shout out to Renan Ferreira. You can probably retire after this if you want to. But yeah, I think Francis Ngannou does win the fight, and I think he does win by knockout in the first round. A little bit of an interesting one, though, that I have to say. How many pay-per-views do you think that this card sells? Because we know that the PFL is paying Francis Ngannou an insane amount of money. His opponent's making $2 million. Ngannou's got to be making at least $2 million, right? Plus pay-per-view shares. I mean, there's a lot of money in behind Francis Ngannou here, and I'm not seeing that many people talk about him. So, be interesting to see how many pay-per-views this card does sell. But it is going to be a good card nonetheless. The odds on the Ngannou fight is minus 300-ish. I do think he beats Ferreira. I mean, if Ngannou loses to Ferreira, then it's just going to be really bad for the PFL. Like, really bad. But I think Ngannou wins. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Are you going to watch this card? Are you excited for this card? And I'll see you guys in the next video.